Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Microsoft Research's Race and Technology lecture series. We're bringing together leading scholars at the intersection of race studies and technology studies to address the many ways these domains intersect in computer science, public health, digital media, gaming, surveillance, and other domains. Hopefully, these lectures have been exposing you to new ideas and understandings of how race and tech construct each other and with what consequences. Maybe it's made you a little uncomfortable. Maybe it's made you invigorated. Ideally, it's done a bit of both. If you've missed the previous lectures, they're all available to you on YouTube, and your registration for this event gets you in. Today, we get to hear from one of my personal favorites, Dr. André Brock, who is an associate professor of media studies at Georgia Tech. I have been following Dre's career for a very long time as he has opened up new spaces for conversation and developed new methodological approaches for understanding both Western technoculture and Black cybercultures in contexts including social media, video games, blogs, and more. In 2016, we at Microsoft Research in New England were lucky to host him for 6 months while he was working on his book, Distributed Blackness, African American Cybercultures, which I will try to hold up and hopefully you can see it because it has a very beautiful cover, which has since won awards from both the Association of Internet Researchers and the Popular Culture Association. Dr. Brock is also a founder of the Mellon Foundation-funded Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Critique, and Optimism Network, or DISCO initiative that you heard about during Lisa Nakamura's talk a couple of months ago, which is a cross-institution initiative that focuses on digital inequality, race, and ability. I will be monitoring questions in the chat, and I encourage you to pose them as they arise rather than waiting to the last 5 minutes, although we will welcome them then as well. We'll have plenty of time for live Q&A after the talk, and André would like us to know that he has been through the fire and brimstone of a Reddit AMA and is ready for your questions. So with that, let me turn it over to Dre. Here we go. André Brock, go.
Good afternoon and greetings from Atlanta. I'm André Brock. I'm an associate professor of Black Digital Studies here at the Georgia Institute of Technology, and I'm here to give a talk to you guys today called On Race and Technoculture. Before I begin, I'd like to thank my people at the Microsoft Research Social Media Collective in New England, Nancy Bain, Mary Gray, and Charlton Gillespie. I'd also like to thank Charlton McElwain, the leader of the Center for Race and Digital Studies, who I'm also affiliated with out of NYU, for inviting me to join y'all to have this talk. I'm really looking forward to it. That being said, let's talk about my slides. So last year, I wrote a book theorizing about Black folk and the internet. I used Twitter as data to make the claim that there's more than one way to do internet and, by extension, technology. That while we are urged to invest in technologies like predictive algorithms, which are described as beneficial, proactive, promising, strikingly successful, cost-effective, incredibly accurate, these technologies are undergirded by beliefs about certain people who my friend Ramon Amaro describes as Black technical objects. And I turned to Twitter, but also to do this theorizing in order to make it clear that as opposed to the structures of Western technoculture, which I'll describe shortly, Black folk bring a divergent perspective to their technology use and to their digital practice. So about that technoculture, I have a brief quote on the screen from my book that technoculture is the American mythos, an interweaving of technology, culture, self, politics, and identity. Right, and in this last chapter of my book, I spent quite a bit of time unpacking that statement paraphrased on the screen, and I'll briefly recap some of that for you today. So let me begin with a bold claim based on the above, that technology, as an abstract concept, functions as a white mythology. Despite claims of America as a diverse society, whiteness is understood and represented as the default American identity, while its values, beliefs, and politics shape outcomes for all citizens and immigrants. I needed to work through this claim in my book in order to develop this theory of Black technoculture, a theory that recognizes that this version of Blackness, because of course Blackness existed before modernity, but this version of Blackness is created by modernity, politics, and whiteness, and so seeks to differentiate, well, my book seeks to then to differentiate how Black folk think, act, and talk about themselves as technological beings. Because America, as an ideal, as an institution, and as a set of racialized practices, is the matrix for Blackness. Blackness is ineffably American, and our dogged pursuit of American beliefs in equality, democracy, and fairness, even as Black folks experience daily life leavened by the understanding that the American telos of progress depends upon anti-Blackness. So this is what I came up with. I call it the Black Technocultural Matrix, and I'll tell you why later. But for now, I wanted to briefly mention the qualities of this matrix, the things that I believe are the beliefs that shape what Black people do when they're interacting with information technologies or technology in general. And they are Blackness as an identity, modernity, America, intersectionality, invention and style, and the future. And just a brief note, I have America in asterisk because I wanted to recognize that while Black people are inframed by America's acquisition of them during the slave trade, that the Black diaspora actually covers most of the entire Western Hemisphere. So Latin America, Central America, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, right? And all those spaces, as well as the imperial aspects of Western technoculture, so the UK, France, Belgium, and other spaces, all of them have qualities of what I call a diasporic Blackness, which will differ in some particulars from American Blackness, right? But for me, my focus is American Blackness. Right? So I'm theorizing here a Black cultural relationship with technology, drawn upon the Black American experience, which is shaped by relationships with whiteness and with technology from a social and political subject position. This is necessary to examine how information and communication technologies afford Blackness a differently subscribed space within which to luxuriate and grow, which is much different from the digital divide research that I came up on in the late 90s and early 2000s. That Blackness online is never free from white racial ideology, but it's also no longer materially coerced by it, and that this possibility exists because of the disembodiment enabled by virtuality. That is, when participating in an online space, Blackness lives as an existential, a meta, if you will, as an existential here that is largely unrestricted by the fixed nature and pejorative reduction of the Black body that occurs offline. Online, I'm not only a point of view, but I'm also a point that is viewed. And so the digital offers possibilities for communicating, performing, and apprehending Blackness through practice and discourse, and in doing so diminishes the theoretical power of a concept I call anti-Blackness. So anti-Blackness, which argues that Blackness is a point of non-communicability or social death, it loses power as it's confronted by the technical visibility and cultural virtuosity of Black digital practice, such as Black Twitter hashtags, TikTok videos, or other content and practices done by Black practitioners. In this reformulation, Blackness highlights the matrix quality of Blackness highlights the integration of the mind and body as a reasoning, knowing subject, returning authorial control and intent over those aspects of Blackness to Black people. This matrix quality of Blackness, then, is a communitarian enactment of intentionally being Black across spaces that are either completely Black culture, outside of Black culture, or a mixture of the two. Where whiteness gains power from obscuring its internal differences in order to be perceived as a universal subject, Black technoculture does not do the same. Instead, it is an affordance for social joy and inventive creativity against the desiccation of modernity, racism, and labor capitalism. So I came to this way of theorizing about Black technoculture by adopting what I call an epistemological standpoint. Or another way to understand that is the phrase, the cliche, you should walk a mile in another man's shoes, as a way to understand where he's coming from. And while that suggests empathy for another, it didn't necessarily work for the type of formal structured inquiry that I wanted to do into how belief shapes technological devices and practices. Right. So standpoint for this one is a position from which to view oneself, one's group, and the world, and how to exert power over each. Right? It's epistemological because this perspective informs how the world is defined. Right? It asks, who gets to be human? Who gets to ask the questions of the world? And what is truth? So this epistemological standpoint tells us that the world is real, but we can only view it from our positionality. That objectivity is possible. Right? And this kind of analytic move refuses racism, capitalism, and white supremacy while presenting their logics and outcomes as subjective truths. So I always start off with theory, which is a mistake. I've been told that I should start off with a story. So let me offer you an example to visualize what I'm working toward, what I had to work through in order to get to this theory of Black technoculture. And so I said that technology serves as a white mythos, and this image or set of images may help you understand why. I'm sure many of you remember Palmer Luckey, a young tech wonderkind whose Oculus virtual reality headset wowed the mainstream press and venture capitalists, leading to this cover story on a prominent magazine featuring this awkward image on the right, which I should describe as a mundane white man dressed in a banal clothing, polo shirt and jeans, right? Definitely not a professional as we're trained to think of them, right? And he's seemingly in a backdrop of a virtual pastoral beach environment, because remember, it's a virtual environment, but I could say that we also don't know what he's actually seeing. There's no real way to understand that what he's seeing in those goggles is reflected by the image that time placed behind him, right? And as we're understanding his placement, we also see that he's leaping in the air barefoot to evoke the coming joys of virtual reality for all. Now, I will say that the internet immediately picked up on just how goofy this image is, and it was immediately memed everywhere and anywhere, right? Which leads us to the second image, which hopefully is clear enough for you to see what the real driver of our modern internet is, which is actually sex and porn, right? And this image illustrates that by showing that instead of jumping in the air to experience the joys of sand and water against his feet, Lucky is enthusiastically reacting to the embrace of a virtual nude, an outline of a virtual nude woman who he's messily, enthusiastically kissing, right? And you might say, well, he can't help how he looks. That's just how he built. Or that's just how the internet is, to refer to how these memes sprang up immediately. But from my outsider perspective, my epistemological standpoint, I also see a white masculine representation of the tech elite, financially blessed by the VC gods to pursue a computer-enabled dream of transcendence, leaving his body behind to explore virtual utopias and escape our climate change world. The memes linking of virtual reality to pornified relationships with virtual women was just a happy coincidence, but also speaks to how porn is the basis of our modern internet and how technoculture around embodiment and sexuality pervades that online world, right? Where it affords a type of control over both the material world and the bodies of women. Now, what we didn't realize at the time, in 2014, when that image was on time, 2015, right, was how consequential this technology would be. Facebook bought Oculus a year before that tech demo and the resulting image, and other tech stalwarts like Sony, HTC, Samsung, Valve, and Microsoft were frantically racing to bring their virtual reality tech to market, right? I've had a Connect. It wasn't fun, right? Now, speaking for myself, I thought virtual reality was a fad. The tech is too expensive, uncomfortable, and the content simply wasn't there to encourage people to buy in. Although my mentor, Lisa Nakamura, reminded me today that for VR, porn is the iceberg underneath the small sliver of appropriate content that perhaps spaces like Oculus and Facebook are hoping to populate the metaverse with. Right? So more fool me, because VR is the centerpiece of Facebook's renaming of itself as Meta, based on its aspirations of reshaping the internet into a metaverse. Once again, we have a wealthy white male looking to computers to elevate society's consciousness, to change our embodied socialities into a virtual transcendent space, even as his company's real-world activities are under investigation around the globe for destabilizing democracies, escalating public health crises, and even leading young women to suicide and mental harm. Read the room, Mark. So all of these things are captured in a similar construct, the one I base my black technocultural construct on. And this is the white technocultural matrix. The Western, I'm sorry, ahead of myself. The Western technocultural matrix. And so this was outlined by Joel Dienerstein, and it's comprised of 6 qualities similar to my own: progress, religion, modernity, whiteness, masculinity, and the future. While all are worthy of discussion, today I want to honor Dienerstein's call to racializing technology by including whiteness, because whiteness usually is not seen. That is, whiteness is often understood as, well, the move he made was to make whiteness's racialization visible, right? As opposed to assigning it as a universal identity or simply the human race, right? And so by focusing on whiteness and modernity, I hope to give you some insights that I derived while building out the Black Technocultural Matrix of what exactly is going on behind the scenes, behind the programming, behind the algorithms, behind the training data. Right? So one way to do that, and how I made the bridge from this matrix to my own, was being able to recognize that Dienerstein identifies whiteness, but doesn't clearly locate it, doesn't clearly explain it as a locus of control and coercion. So I'll do that for him by adding a 7th quality to his matrix, anti-blackness. And I bring that in because while modernity can be understood as a categorizing and extractive ideology and set of practices and institutions, anti-blackness justifies modernity's reliance on bodies easily amenable to these categories and extractions. It does so primarily by locking black folk out of the category of the human, bracketing us as technical objects, never subjects. For example, and it's a rough one, consider the enslaved African. At once a commodity, a working, and a being capable of reproducing infinite labor units, Western capitalism and American governmentality needed to constrain black bodies into shapes more amenable to their use. The U.S. Constitution rendered black bodies as 3/5 of a being for voting purposes, yet unable to exercise a vote. And this led to the creation of the Electoral College as a strategy to diffuse the immense political power, but importantly, not the racial ideology of the suddenly populous southern states. Conversely, blacks could not realize their own value on the labor market after emancipation, as they were consistently and are consistently underpaid compared to other races and ethnicities. Moreover, their cultural creative efforts are often captured by corporations and by white folk with little to no compensation. Furthermore, institutions from banks to schools to dating apps render blackness as less valuable, less attractive, less intelligent, or less moral. So I've talked a little bit about modernity, but I want to make clear my connections between both anti-blackness and modernity beyond the slavery example, because that was back in the day. None of y'all own slaves anymore, I hope. And so anti-blackness and modernity, and whiteness and modernity. Right? So for anti-blackness, the definition I started from was one about arts, culture, and society. And drawing from the work of Frank Wilderson, he argues anti-blackness is a non-communicable structural position in society, which is more than just white people being deaf to what blackness is. It's that they are not able to be seen. And if you think about the title of Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man, that really captures exactly what Wilderson was talking about. Wilderson goes on to say that blackness is a quality that is incapable of being alienated, which is one of the greatest concerns of modernity, that we have been alienated from our true selves because of our use of technology, right? Because alienation is a quality of the human, which is denied to blackness, right? For modernity and technoculture, I argue that data and modernity is the genesis of data and processes ostensibly proving that communities living outside normalcy are verifiably outside normalcy for profit or for governmentality. Right? And discussions of technology tend to avoid white privilege or an investment in inequalities of knowledge or access because they want to apply these technologies across generic contexts that happen to be structured by whiteness. Right? I chose, however, in Distributed Blackness to explicitly not acknowledge that anti-Blackness and its libidinal tension powering the political economy of racism, mediated by the digital, comes in the forms of investment strategies by VCs, hiring practices at STEM institutions or recruitment practices at STEM-serving higher education institutions, or even algorithmic design, is often driven by the libidinal tensions between capitalism, modernity, anti-Blackness, and necropolitics. And I felt it was necessary to add that last one, necropolitics, in response to what I see as how governments are dealing with COVID and the ways that it is killing people and the libidinal strategies they're taking on rather than the scientific strategies to mitigate the effects that COVID is having on their populations. So Britain's COVID cases are rising. America is still experiencing over 1,800 deaths a day because instead of confronting the COVID infection with science and public health policies that have been clearly proven to be effective, we instead rely on individual efforts to contain the disease through lack of mask mandates or vaccine mandates. So coming back to whiteness then, American whiteness is inextricably bounded by and in relation to Blackness, even as it reserves qualities of individualism and universalism for itself. Right? And from this perspective, whiteness is a representation of the normal, of the human. It is spirited, it is disciplined, it is rational, and it is enterprising, productive, efficient, civil, and civilized, right? And we can understand all of those taken together as the control of self and of others. So modernity can be understood then as an insistence that different frames of philosophical inquiry, ontology, axiology, and aesthetics belong to distinct knowledge domains, a position which privileges whiteness Cartesian and Christian attestation of the separation of mind and body, or, for a more recent example, current trends of mindfulness and self-care where you are encouraged to take on individual practices of repairing yourself as opposed to getting, say, something as crucial as universal health care. Right? For example, where modernity and capitalism insist that work is emancipatory and provides agency, Black folk have long understood that work really only signifies servitude, misery, and subordination. Then I should be clear, I'm referring to industrial modernity here, the command of space and time through network communication, the development of the nation state, which in the process reworks relationships between the self, between commerce, institutions, and technology. And so I mentioned that technoculture is the American mythos. Modernity's own mythic capacity depends upon our awareness of and our reflection on how our lives differ from pre-modern or even recent social cultural conditions. One of the best or worst, depending on where you sit, examples of that is the recent slogan, "Make America Great Again." Right? And in this, modernity is deeply tied to progress and the future, further cementing the role of technology as the spirit of the West. Through modernity, trust and risk have supplanted belief and fate, because modernity depends upon the valorization of rationality, the scientific method, and logic as the most appropriate avenues to understand the world and our place in it, all the while centering whiteness as the group best equipped to deploy it. Modernity provides whiteness a technocultural smokescreen, furnishing society with an overriding logic of correlation and hierarchy hidden under the illusion of computational and institutional objectivity. Meanwhile, the fictive substances of race and racialization reinforce a false assumption of coherence and objectivity. As a recent example, it appears that people on Nextdoor are now saying that they are going to hold Thanksgiving trick-or-treat rituals for their children on days that are not Halloween in order to prevent those people from coming in, invading their neighborhood, and getting candy. Right? So the presence of the other makes coherent the practices of white folk to protect resources that they deem should only belong to them. And I call this capacity to shape itself to whatever circumstance or technology, like Nextdoor, as interpretive flexibility. Right? For whiteness, it denotes the capacity to be simultaneously understood as individual and everyone. Technologically, consider your browser, right, which is placed on every desktop screen, right, and operating system menu, while harboring an infinite variety of web content. If you use someone else's browser, even if it says Safari or Chrome on the label, their bookmarks won't be the same, their browsing practices may not be the same, their extensions won't be the same, right? They will have configured it for their individual preferences, and they will have websites in their history that you perhaps have never seen before. So individualization, yet everywhereness. More recently, look to today's premium smartphones. They are smart precisely because of their interpretive flexibility. The entire screen fills to focus on one app and one app only, despite an operating system that offers multitasking and application switching, which gives us instant access to all other apps on the phone and the entire internet. Right? So again, interpretive flexibility, the capacity to occupy a position as an individual instance, yet harboring the same capacity for universality. Last piece of this, and I wanted to bring this up as a way to head towards the end of this presentation, right, is that across distributed blackness, you may have heard me talk about the libidinal and belief, right? And I won't go at all into what libidinal economy is, apart than to say that it is a way for me to operationalize, to have a empirical view of how beliefs are shaping digital practices and artifacts. Right? And so for a libidinal economy of the digital, one of the things that I claim is that the digital has the libidinal capacity of elasticity, right? As it uses code, hardware, and protocols to simulate entire worlds while creating virtual spaces for human to human, human to computer, or computer to computer sociality. Right? Elasticity also means that while WordPress has the same 30 or so free themes, each theme instance on a particular website will be configured in ways that make meaning to the user and their intended audience. Further, this elasticity affords belief. Right? I've mentioned multiple times that I see technologies as a three-part, well, I should have said it out loud, but I'm now saying it, that technologies should be understood as a three-part construct. There are artifacts, the hardware, software, protocols, and content, right? And people. They're practices, whether it's communicating with the server to let the developer know that the person playing this game is authenticated. God, I hate online always games, right? Or if it's simply whether or not your human resources at your corporation provides great benefits in the form of ever-flowing refrigerators of snacks, right? Specifically because you guys are affluent coders who need to focus on your task and not be distracted by bodily needs such as leaving work to go to lunch, right? And I argue that these beliefs power technology in general, but there are also some specific to the digital. We could talk about that in the Q&A. But this elasticity is denied to non-whites in Western technoculture, right? Black and indigenous folk are fixed as primitive, while South Asian and East Asian folk are fixed as spiritual. So I also argue that we could understand the digital as religious, operating as a near worship of the spiritual power of data as knowledge and its all-seeing, omniscient capacity to simulate probability as a balm for social ills, a technical fix. Rather than putting faith in the works of a supreme being, religion recenters technology as a source of blessings and ills, either a digital utopia where speech is free and virtual spaces are democratic, or a hellscape of incivility, terroristic acts, and disinformation. Right? Religion is also a grounding for the digital links to transcendence. So you may remember I talked about meta and the metaverse, recently, right? And this is just as much a part of the digital or the technological sublime, where the Cartesian and Christian duality of mind and body says that the best way to become transcendent is to render the body in ones and zeros to allow us to give up the bonds of material existence. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Right. The last couple of beliefs, future, can be understood as the West, and by the West, I'm pretty much saying whiteness, quest for omniscience, where informational control over bodies, the census, or surveillance cameras and license plate readers, right? And the material world, so networks and capitalism's demand for datification, right, is directly linked to spiritual, economic, and political gain. Information technologies are always seen as futuristic, drawing as they do on beliefs about the control of the spirit and the abstract reason of mathematics and code. Progress is closely tied to the future, as it is measured by the increase, reliance on, and deployment of computational solutions to social problems. All right, lots of theory. We can talk about it. Let me offer one last example, one that may be a little bit closer to home, right? And I want to talk about how digital spaces in their elasticity afford certain capabilities designed by their implemented by their designers for their imagined audiences, and how other audiences or users take up those capacities in ways that confound the original intent. So I probably don't need to explain much about the interface and structure of LinkedIn since y'all own it, right? What I can say as a researcher doing this for the last 15 years or so is that LinkedIn is an odd social network, depending as it does on libidinal tensions around work as an identity, specifically a corporate, white-collar, professional identity, and the corresponding information management, right? Appropriate work discourses and representations, so typo-free profiles or resumes, or formal headshots instead of selfies for profile pictures, and a much more civil set of discursive strategies, including moderation, than other social networks, right? So your other social networking experiences rely on some of the same mechanisms that that LinkedIn does, right? The profile as a source of sharing information and learning about people, being able to surf that profile as a web of connections between you and recognized entities, including the site, but mostly your friends and affiliates, right? And the capacity to share content that elaborates upon your presentation of self done in that profile, right? Whether that's multimedia, whether that's me posting memes to Twitter, or any other ways that you think of where you participate on these networks. LinkedIn is really kind of a different space, right? And so I wanted to talk about discourse strategies, particularly moderation, because moderation is one way to control how users represent themselves. And that's what brought this space to my attention. You see, LinkedIn has only gradually emerged as a place where Black professionals feel able to articulate workplace problems around race and racialization. And the more woke among you may recognize that this has been an ongoing tension over the last couple of years following the death of George Floyd, where many CEOs and other tech executives say that the workplace is not a place to discuss social injustice. We're just supposed to focus on the code and the screen, right? Don't leave that other stuff out the door. Right? So a New York Times article argues that the pandemic and the death of George Floyd sparked this shift. And again, we can talk about that during the Q&A. As the people that she interviewed, the Black folk that she interviewed, felt that the topic of police malfeasance and social injustice should be discussed with their colleagues, the people they spend 8 to 9 hours a day with, in addition to their personal or public social networks. I argue, though, that this use of LinkedIn as a convivial space, right, as opposed to a strictly social instrumental space for finding connections to get better jobs, right, can also be attributed as a partial counter to the growth of job searches powered by AI and algorithms. So we started with Monster, now we're at Indeed and other spaces which tout how they use AI to give recruiters a much better perspective on the vast amount of information sent up to them by job seekers. Right. And so LinkedIn becomes a convivial space in that it is a semi-formal network, right, where personal lives have begun to become part of the regular discourse of how LinkedIn conducts itself, as opposed to the standard Rolodex, right, upon which it was originally modeled. And so as you may imagine, race is a sensitive topic in any particular space, but for a number of Black folk on LinkedIn, professionals, right, they felt that LinkedIn's moderation policies often led to them either being shadow banned or having their content removed altogether. LinkedIn says these were algorithmic problems, that the algorithm automatically took down things because they found terms that would be perceived as objectionable or divisive, right? One such post that was taken down was a post written by a young woman named Aisha Smith, right? And she was talking about the house Negro. Now, Negro is the only word in the article that I could possibly even find objectionable, right? And Joseph's, I'm sorry, I said Smith, her last name is Joseph. Joseph's post was really discussing how uncomfortable white people in corporate spaces find it to talk about issues of race, injustice, and racialization, right? Not because it's corporate, but because that's something that white people don't necessarily have to deal with on a regular basis. A Pew study from a few years back found that white people on the internet tend to see and post content about race 60% less than Black or brown folk. Right? So if they're not seeing it in their personal perambulations around the web, they're certainly not really willing to bring that to the workplace. It offers too many possibilities for HR to get up under you. Right? And so this particular article that Joseph posted on LinkedIn was talking about, one, that difficulty, but also something that's particularly germane to Black experiences in corporate world, how certain Black people manage to ingratiate themselves and achieve greater visibility and therefore economic compensation by becoming what she called house Negroes, or Black people who are willing to use their identity to justify corporate practices of modernity, such as layoffs, slowdowns, and the like, or lack of promotion, right? Or poor performance reviews, right? They were willing to say, well, perhaps she was saying these Black people are much more willing to deny the presence of race or racialization in these particular instances, right? And thus lending those particular problems a credibility that they would not have had otherwise. For this, she argues, the post was taken down. Right? There's much more to this. I didn't really get enough information together to where I could present a longer discussion of the data, but I will close with this particular piece by saying that the intrusion of the intrusion of topics that are relevant to the Black experience, such as wanting to be seen as a whole human being, on a space that is designed to really kind of limit your beingness to your work identity, is one way in which Black people come to vivify the spaces that they find themselves in, whether offline or online. This is something that I argue Black people bring as excess of life, right? They bring their particular refusal to bow to the dictates of modernity and labor capitalism so that their whole selves can be seen, right? So let me close with a little bit of theory because I couldn't help myself, right? So ultimately, for distributed Blackness, and I want to end on a positive point for Blackness, right? Even as I've dragged white people to the ends of the earth and back, I want to end with the positive point of Blackness because I'm not sure that has always come forth in the presentations that you guys may have seen up to this point. So for the Black technocultural matrix, the Black sense of self is formed, informed, and reformed at the moment of dissonance between self-perception and any externally constructive view of Black life. These tensions are the conditions from which new iterations of the Black self are generated, and they exceed the reductions of representation and visibility. And they form what Foucault has called a technology of self, a system of feedback, which permits individuals to effect, by their own means or with the help of technology, a certain number of operations on their own bodies, thoughts, souls, conduct, and way of being to transform themselves in order to attain a certain state of happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or immortality. From my book, that looks like Black Twitter. I argue that Black Twitter manifests style in space, in the raceless void of social networking services premised around interests, affinities, practices, or friends. Black Twitter deploys Black discursive identity and intentionality to vivify the service as a libidinal construct centered on catharsis, invention, and the integration of mind and body. Black aesthetics are intensely libidinal and performative, drawing as they do upon Black community ideals and sociality and the communitarian ethos of Blackness in America. These qualities also distinguish Black technological practice from Western technological practice. That is, for Black technoculture, utility and efficiency are not the ultimate aims. The fixed perception of self that has been inflicted upon Black folk by modernity and white supremacy is a record of what one should be and has been under that regime. But Black identity is what one does after that record has been saved. Right? So I'm a racial realist, right? And here we go with CRT from Derek Bell, right? I acknowledge the permanence of Black folks' subordinate status in American culture and society. But acknowledging such enables me to avoid despair and frees me to imagine and implement strategies that can bring fulfillment and even triumph. So my argument for distributed Blackness is that style and invention are crucial components of Black identity. They are how Black folk negotiate the informational and institutional regimes of anti-Blackness. While they are not solutions to the problem of surveillance in the carceral state, they are instead modes of being, an epistemological standpoint that encourages us to live life to the fullest under the watchful eye of modernity. Thank you.
Thank you. I love your closing image. Goes so well with your book cover. I see that you have been answering some questions during the Q&A and have been looking at them. There are a couple of things you specifically said you would address during the Q&A. So, and then there are other things I think we could probably elaborate on, and I would encourage folks to bring in new questions if you have them. I wonder, why don't we start with, because it's such a core concept in your work, you want to say more about what you mean by libidinal and where that's coming from and how you think about that concept? It's so funny. I have to laugh because the one thing you said to me before was, I guess I won't get any questions about libidinal then. And here we are with the first question. Tell me what you mean by libidinal, Andre.
So I came to libidinal economy through the works of Frank Wilderson, Fred Moten, and other theorists of Afro-pessimism, and their articulation of libidinal economy struck me because they're really clear in tying anti-Blackness to modernity. For them, it's the arts, and for me, it's for technology. And so libidinal economy helps describe the pleasures, the pains, the catharsis, any excess of energy which informs, surrounds, and powers most political economic things that we think about, but also just most of everyday life. So I come from information science. We studied the Shannon and Weaver communication model, right? So some of you may be familiar with it. It was basically sender, receiver, straight line communication, and everything else outside that was noise. Libidinal economy says both the sender and the receiver are in their own libidinal moments, and the communication itself has libidinal intensities that you may not see. And the way I try to give illustrate that is talking about the ways that people greet each other. I'm a huge fan of Du Bois. There's a lovely article by Jane Hill on communication differences between Black and white people based on her understanding of Du Bois' double consciousness. And she says that white people often view pleasantries such as good morning, how are you, as useless talk. They don't necessarily see them as anything other than a waste of time, right? And while some of you may say, well, I don't feel that way, particularly if you're from the South, I can attest, having lived in the Midwest and the Northeast, that in many ways that pleasantry is just seen as useless chatter, right? But for Black folk, particularly in spaces like the Northeast, I live in Ann Arbor for some time and Champaign, Illinois, but also in the South, that greeting is integral to your recognizing somebody as a part of your community. So if you don't speak, especially if you walk in someone's house or see them on the street and make eye contact, that's offensive, right? And I see that particular mode of recognition as a libidinal economic moment where you recognize that perhaps you may not see this person again tomorrow, or you may have recognized this person on the street as a human being, and you should greet them as if they're a human being. And to me, that really drives where libidinal economy goes, right? For technoculture, that matrix that I put on the screen, actually both matrices, the white Western and the Black technoculture, are intended to articulate some of the libidinal tensions I see pervading the largely instrumental discourses we hear around technology, right? So when a phone is introduced, we'll talk about specs, we'll talk about functions, right? But we don't necessarily talk about the beliefs of the people who actually use the phone, right? And so one way I get my students to articulate this is I ask them, what's the difference between an Android user and an Apple user, right? And they were much more vocal about this a few years back. Now, since the phones look alike, they don't really care, except when it comes to the blue versus the green iMessage bubbles, right? If you talk to them about iMessage, the green iMessage bubbles is a huge source of dissatisfaction that iPhone users have towards Android users. They feel it socially segregates them and they don't really want them as a part of their conversation. Conversely, Android users feel Apple users are unsophisticated, consumer focused, even faddish, right? And unwilling to deal with the complexities of computer technology, which is hilarious to me, right? Because most Android users don't even know how to root their own phones, right? And so that belief structure, which I operationalize as libidinal economy, is my attempt to say that there is actually a systematic inquiry possible into what people believe about technologies, and those beliefs are just as constitutive as what the technology is and how we use it and the ways we understand ourselves with relationship to technology. So libidinal, in part because Lyotard, who coined libidinal economy, was interested in this concept he calls jouissance, which he connects directly to eros and the orgasm, but also just to an excess of life, right? Anytime you see a decision, economists have had this problem for years. They've been trying to say there's a rational person making economic decisions. What they've learned is that people are not rational when it comes to money, right? Why should they be? Money is a deeply emotional subject, right? And so that libidinal economy helps to explain that political economic failing to see of what people do with technologies.
Awesome. We got a couple of follow-up questions about libidinal. Does libidinal also mean humanity? And when you connect these ideas of libidinality to technology, do you mean that in the very specific, do you mean that in the broadest sense of technology? Like, would you consider the creation of the written word or the phonetic English language as examples of the technologies to which libidinal economy is tied?
I absolutely would tie it back to written language. If you think about Plato's lament about the loss that he was feeling people experience when we move from orality to the written word, even as he was writing it down for future people to read, right? And so Walter Ong has really been helpful in this regard. And Catherine Knight still cites Ong really productively when she talks about social media in particular as a secondary orality, where we have returned to more appreciated modes of emotional expression, emoji, bitmoji. Thank God nobody uses those anymore, right? Emoji, bitmoji, memes, whether it's image macros or short videos or GIFs, right? We have opened up our computer-mediated communication usage to be able to express that emotion, that libidinal affect, right? In many ways, the younger generation has taken it even further. So my child often gets upset with me when I interject in a text message conversation an ellipsis, the 3 dots, right? Because for younger people, that means awkward. While for my generation, we're just like, I'm thinking, right? And so there are various meaning-making substrates that I would argue are attached libidinally, not just functionally, to language as well, right? For the question about humanity, and talking with Ron Eglash at Michigan, who's one of my favorite authors to cite, and I consider him a mentor, we were talking about the idea that Latour's actor network theory brings machines into the construct of sociality that people and institutions have, but I am trying to add additional considerations around race, gender, sexuality, class, other identity characteristics, because I feel that those things are not necessarily considered in the social environments in which computers are deposited, right? So I grew up on org theory and social informatics, and they want us to consider the social context, but not whether a male executive decides to enforce a particular mode of administrative busy work by making all his secretaries use LibreOffice, sorry. Right, and LibreOffice, Microsoft Office is so old now that
you're allowed to criticize. It's okay.
Right. But I mean, Microsoft Office is so old now. You guys probably don't remember the fights between WordPerfect, Office, LibreOffice, and the like. But also how people were saying they were transforming the way administrative work was done without necessarily realizing that they were consistently feminizing the way that work was done. Right. So attorneys, professors, right, suddenly didn't have to turn to a secretary to hand type their letter, right? They could ask their secretary to computerize their letter. But also it transformed the way that professionals had to do their work. So now I got to type my own damn letters, right? And in such a way, it changes my relationship with the technology. So libidinal, that does also mean a human, I want to say phenomenology, but I don't think that's the right word, right? But a human interaction with technology that's above and beyond what the technology can do.
Super, thank you. There's some questions. Well, there's some questions about work and black and white attitudes toward work. Both we have this question of, could you please elaborate your statement about black versus white attitudes toward work and give us a sense of what sources that comes from? And then I think that fits nicely with James Ashley's question, where he notes that you buried the lead regarding efficiency as a modern/white value.
Sure
How
did.
would an engineer of color like me approach their job in a corporate environment that values profitability as a condition of continued employment without also valuing efficiency and results? I feel like I can't quite get out of that particular mental prison. So you want to speak to that, both the grounding for your claim that there are different attitudes, racial attitudes toward work, and then also maybe we can help James think about his way out of that puzzle.
Okay, so the first part, there are two historical canonical sources. The first is Du Bois says there's nothing more valuable in this capitalistic economy that we must exist within than the laborer's laughter on a Saturday night, when he is free of work and he's out with his friends, dressed to the nines, drinking, enjoying himself, right? And there are other cultures, which also I'm specifically thinking of Western tech bro / frat bro culture, which extraordinarily valorizes drinking. Maybe other drugs, but I can't speak to that. I've just been in Big Ten schools, but also Japanese culture, which valorizes drinking as a way of just of relief after long days of work, right? So that desire to unwind after work is a human thing. But if you begin to understand that the black was never considered human in the first place, they were particularly considered black technical objects, you'll see that black people will necessarily have a differential orientation to the supposed productive and efficient aims of what work can do, because in many cases, that efficiency is based on extracting as much labor and profit from them as possible, right? And so for that particular claim, I fall back on Zora Neale Hurston's claim in Of Mules of Men, that if work was good, white people would have kept that for themselves too. Right. Right. Which is just, I mean, I put it really glibly.
Zing!
Right. I put it really glibly. But if you think about the ways that the pandemic has shifted our attitudes towards work, where we realize that the amount of money that we were being underpaid to do for the essential workers, largely backbreaking and unappreciated work, you'll see that more folk have come to the black position that work is something you do, but it should not be all that you do. There is more to living life than being able to work and make some money or lots of money, right? And so to move from that to the young man's question, right?
We don't know his age. He might be elderly.
I'm going to say he's younger than me because I feel old today, right? When in a corporate environment, as an engineer, as a technologist, as a Q&A, even as a Q&A person, or anybody as a manager, right? I think as a person of color, in addition to the ethical considerations of whether or not a technology does broad harms to, say, the environment, I'm laughing because crypto does immense harm to the environment. Nobody really seems to pay attention to that, right? But broad harms to the environment, or perhaps maybe damaging to the perception of the institution, I feel that Black people should also take on the additional responsibility, and it's a heavy one, of understanding moral harms, right? So in any particular case where data extraction is a feature of the algorithmic model you're trying to promote, or even of the platform that you're trying to build, how will it affect people who are not the ideal user, right? Well, how would it affect differently able people? How would it affect queer people? In many cases, you'll find, right, like Facebook's use of affinities to sell people's information to real estate agents and housing real estate agents for housing. They found that, yeah, you can sell that information to those entities, but they will then use it to further discriminate, redlining, denial of mortgages, right? Even guiding people away from nice areas, right? So that they can then load them up with higher interest rates and worse mortgage terms even if they're similarly qualified as a white person. They're taking that data extraction and using it to implement pre-existing harms on people. And as a person of color, I think it's incumbent upon us to start thinking through above and beyond what our company asks for us and do what you can to advocate. And it will be fruitless many times. It will get you yelled at many times, right? It is a thankless endeavor. But by doing so, you at least pull white people's coat and say, hey, you should consider more than just how this will make us money, right? Um, a very like tangential example is thinking about the Transamerica Pipeline, which was implemented in British Vancouver, and they shaved the hillsides, they strip mined the hillsides, removed the trees, right, so that they could put this pipeline in, which ostensibly brought oil to the United States. Now, those same highways that were under that pipeline have been washed away by climate change. Right. So in the pursuit of profit, they neglected to steward the world that they actually had to live in. And I feel even though our work as technologists is kind of abstract sometimes, we get lost because we're a piece of a puzzle putting together things to build larger structures or larger platforms. We can still advocate for people who are like ourselves or related to ourselves or even look like us, right? In the implementation of that product and how it's marketed to other people.
I hope that helped work your way out of that puzzle. I feel like the pandemic has led to a shift in some around rethinking productivity and whether we ought to be thinking more about these kinds of factors when we think about what does it mean to be a thriving organization or a productive workplace. But that's for another conversation, probably. Somebody has said, you mentioned disco. What is that? You want to give a quick, what is disco?
Disco
Other than an incredibly well-named network.
Right. It's the acronym for a Mellon Foundation grant that I got with some co-PIs, including Lisa Nakamura, Catherine Eichsteele, Ray Fouché, M. Remy Yurgo, and Stephanie Dinkins at various institutions. And it's digital inquiry, speculation, computation, and optimism. And we were asked to consider building out a network of principal investigators and institutions interested in advancing race and technology, right? Broadly construed, all of us do digital in some form. Remy does disability, Stephanie is an artist, Catherine does Black feminism, Ray is a technoscientist. I'm not really sure what it is I do, right? But we all work together to try to build different approaches to race in the digital, to foster networks of emerging scholars interested in critical race and critical information studies.
Great.
There was one thing I totally lost it. Go ahead, Nancy. Are there more?
Are there more? There's more questions that we're going to be able to get to, although you did speak to several. It was not all Tarleton. Many of them were not Tarleton. We have some thank you for the talks. I guess I really like that you started off by making clear that you were talking primarily about Black Americans, and then we had a question asking about what you saw as differences between that and diasporic Black cultures, and then we also had a question about Black Africans and African cyberculture, and I realized that you feel like you don't have the depth of expertise to speak on those phenomena as you do about Black American culture, but I am wondering, I know you look and you pay attention, so I'm wondering just as a more informed observer than many in the audience and myself, when you are looking at Africans on the internet and you are looking at non-US Black people on the internet, are you seeing differences in their cyber practices? Do you feel like your Black technoculture matrix it comes out of Black America? To what extent do you think it's confined to that, and to what extent, thinking about things like Black Panther and whatnot, whether there are alternative African versions that might look quite different?
I think there are differences and similarities. In part, some of the diasporic and colonial / imperial Black cultures I follow are the Caribbean ones, so Jamaica and Trinidad, Belize, but also Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa. And one of the things I realize is that their own home languages draw heavily upon both the origins of the African people that are in that space, plus whatever colonial or imperial influence they have. So I have great difficulty following Francophone Black Twitter, right? Because I don't speak French, right? To that also, Nigerian Ghanaian Twitter is really fascinating to me because it is very much in their multiple languages that they employ, right? And they code switch or cross switch between those languages within the same tweets. So it's fascinating to read them and then see other tweets in English. For me, that diasporic influence, that colonial influence is actually what unites them, because although I argue as an Afro-optimist that Blackness existed before modernity, modernity has imposed a very differential type of Blackness on these kinship groups, these tribal groups, these geographic spaces and the like, right? And so there are commonalities because they're all enmeshed within this global network of trade and media production and the like, but then they bring their own internal heterogeneities, right, to bear on the types of discourse that they do. So even in the United States, there are differences between West Coast Twitter, Southern Twitter, and Northeast Twitter, right? And so trying to be aware of those differences is something I'm more capable of doing for a US thing. But as I mentioned in the Q&A, it was important for me to leave space for people who wanted to talk about. And so wanted to talk about differences. So Francesca Shabande and Rihanna Walcott and the UK are talking about Black British experiences. As is Farida Viss, who does not cite my work, but she's still dope, right? Tarcisio Silva and Nina Deora are talking about Black Brazilian influences, right? Because Brazil has a very different view of what race and Blackness is than the United States. And then there are a number of African scholars who I'll specifically mention Kegaro Macharia, but even though Kegaro is not necessarily interested in the digital per se, his work is extremely influential on mine in thinking through what the libidinal may have to do with media interaction, aesthetics, and possibility, right? And so just trying to keep track of those things is hard. Devoting my systematic inquiry to them, it forced me kind of to say, let me go with what I'm good at, as opposed to trying to speak for all Black people and then getting charged with, well, all Black people aren't like that. And I'm like, I know, fam, I know.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, I appreciate your scoping your claims. I think that's really important that we recognize the diversity of cultures that we're actually talking about when we talk about Black people. We are over time. I want to thank you, Andre. This has been fantastic, and thank you everybody for posting such great questions. And I'm sorry, as always, that we didn't get to go into depth about all of them. We got some links to the Disco Network in the chat for you if you want to learn more about that. On December 1st, we're going to be back. So just a couple of weeks, a little sooner than usual because of the holidays coming. In our next talk, we have Sohini Ramachandran from Brown, who is a computational biologist, who's going to be talking about our genomes ourselves and race and genetic testing. So that should be really, really interesting as well. So thank you, everybody. As always, send all your friends and colleagues to watch the talk if you enjoyed it. Thank you for the many kind comments you left for Dre in the chat. And thank you all so much. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, tech team.
Pleasure.